She was just 8 years old, clutching a piece of stale bread in her tiny hands. But in the next 20 minutes, this little girl would do something that would leave a dozen hardened warriors speechless and change the course of two peoples forever. Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the power to break the strongest walls of hatred. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth as Clyde Winslow guided his weathered wagon through the narrow canyon pass. Beside him sat his wife Clara, her knuckles white as she gripped the wooden seat. In the back, 8-year-old Magnolia played quietly with her cornhusk doll, completely unaware of the tension that filled the air like smoke from a distant fire. Clyde's eyes constantly scanned the rocky ridges above them. This was disputed territory, where the line between settler land and tribal hunting grounds blurred like heat waves rising from sun-baked stone. Every rancher knew the stories, whispered around campfires about travelers who entered these canyons and never emerged. "Daddy, I'm hungry." Sevens. Magnolia's sweet voice broke through his worried thoughts. Clara reached into their meager supplies and handed their daughter the last piece of bread they had. It was hard as a rock and barely enough for a child's breakfast, but it was all they could spare. Their destination was still 2 days away, and food was running dangerously low. "Make it last, sweetheart," Clara whispered, her voice tight with concern that had nothing to do with their empty food sacks. Magnolia took the bread gratefully, breaking off tiny pieces and chewing slowly. She had learned not to waste anything, even at her young age. Life on the frontier taught such lessons early and harshly. That's when Clyde saw them. Silhouettes appeared on the canyon rim like shadows given form. 1, then 3, then more than he could count. Warriors on horseback, their weapons glinting in the harsh sunlight. They moved with the fluid grace of people who belonged to this land, who knew every stone and every hidden path. Clyde's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle beside him, but he forced himself to stop. Any sudden movement could be seen as aggression, and with Clara and Magnolia in the wagon, he couldn't risk a confrontation. "Clara," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "Stay calm. Keep Magnolia close." The warriors began their descent, their horses picking their way down the steep slopes with sure-footed precision. They moved in formation, clearly experienced in such encounters. As they drew closer, Clyde could see the war paint on their faces and the determined set of their shoulders. The lead warrior was a man of perhaps 40 winters, his presence commanding respect and fear in equal measure. His dark eyes held the weight of countless battles and the wisdom of someone who had seen too much suffering. This was Chief Royce Bannon, though Clyde didn't know his name. Behind him rode Everett Kane, younger and more volatile, his hand resting on his weapon as he studied the settlers with obvious suspicion. The warriors formed a circle around the wagon, their horses snorting and stamping in the dust. Clyde felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he realized they were completely surrounded. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. But what happened next would challenge everything both sides believed about their enemies. Chief Bannon raised his hand, and the silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush a stone. His eyes moved from Clyde to Clara, then settled on the small figure in the back of the wagon. Magnolia looked up at him with the fearless curiosity that only children possessed, still clutching her precious piece of bread. What the chief saw in that moment would change everything he thought he knew about the people who had come to claim his land. What Chief Bannon saw in that little girl's eyes wasn't fear or hatred. It was something he hadn't encountered in years of dealing with settlers. Pure innocent curiosity. But what made his breath catch was something else entirely. The way she looked at him like he was just another person, not a threat or an enemy. The chief's weathered face remained stone still, but his mind raced. In all his encounters with the white settlers, he had seen fear, anger, contempt, or desperate bargaining. Never this. Never a child who simply looked at him with genuine interest, as if wondering what kind of person he might be beneath the war paint. Everett Kane shifted restlessly on his horse beside him, interpreting the chief's silence as hesitation. The young warrior's hand tightened on his weapon, ready to act if his leader gave the signal. The other warriors watched tensely, waiting for orders that would determine whether this family lived or died. Clyde could feel the sweat trickling down his back despite the morning chill. He knew better than to speak first in a situation like this. One wrong word could trigger violence that would end everything he held dear. Clara's breathing was shallow and quick beside him, her maternal instincts screaming at her to shield Magnolia from what was coming. But Magnolia seemed completely unaware of the danger. She continued to study the painted faces around her with the fascination of a child discovering something new and interesting. To her 8-year-old mind, these were simply people she hadn't met before. Chief Bannon finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of generations of leaders. The words came in his native tongue, sharp and commanding. Though the Winslows couldn't understand the language, the tone was unmistakable. This was an interrogation, not a friendly greeting. Clyde cleared his throat carefully before responding. "We're just passing through, heading west to meet up with other families. We don't want any trouble." The chief's dark eyes narrowed as he studied the man's face, searching for deception. He had learned to read the subtle signs that revealed when settlers were lying, the flickering glances, the nervous swallowing, the way their voices changed pitch. But this man seemed to be telling the truth, desperate though he was. Still, truth or lies made little difference. These people were trespassers on sacred hunting grounds, and their very presence was an insult to his ancestors. The law of the territory was clear. Those who entered without permission paid with their lives or their possessions. Everett Kane urged his horse forward, speaking rapidly in their language. His words were heated, aggressive, and Clyde could guess their meaning even without understanding. The young warrior wanted action, wanted to settle this encounter in the traditional way. But Chief Bannon raised his hand again, silencing his subordinate. His attention had returned to the little girl, who was now breaking off another tiny piece of her bread with the careful precision of someone who knew food was precious. Something about that simple action stirred a memory deep in the chief's mind. A memory of his own daughter at that age, carefully rationing her food during the harsh winter when game was scarce, and the tribe nearly starved. The similarity struck him like a physical blow, but he pushed the emotion aside. Personal memories had no place in matters of territorial justice. Yet, he found himself watching the child more intently, noting details that his warrior's training told him to ignore. What he saw next would test every belief he held about the people who threatened his way of life. The chief noticed something that made his warrior's instincts sharpen with new awareness. The family supplies were nearly depleted. He could see it in the way they held themselves. In the careful manner, the child ate her meager portion. These people weren't conquerors or land grabbers. They were desperate refugees running from something or toward hope. But desperation didn't excuse trespassing on sacred ground. If anything, it made them more dangerous. Everett Kane spoke again, his voice rising with impatience. The other warriors began to murmur among themselves, clearly growing restless with their leader's hesitation. They had encountered many settlers over the years, and the protocol was always the same. Demand payment for passage or remove the threat permanently. Chief Bannon understood their frustration. His people had been hungry for weeks now. The white settlers had disrupted the migration patterns of the buffalo herds, and game had become scarce throughout their traditional hunting grounds. His warriors had families waiting back at camp, children whose ribs showed through their skin, elders growing weak from lack of proper nourishment. These thoughts hardened his resolve. Sentiment was a luxury his people couldn't afford. He began to speak in English, his accent thick, but his words clear. "You cross sacred hunting ground. Payment required for passage." Clyde's heart sank, but he tried to keep his voice steady. "What kind of payment are you looking for?" "We don't have much," but the chief gestured toward their wagon with a sweep of his arm. "All supplies, all horses. You walk." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Walking through this hostile territory without supplies or transportation would be a death sentence, especially with a young child. They might survive a day, Perhaps two if they were extraordinarily lucky. "Please," Clyde said, his voice cracking despite his efforts to remain calm. "We have a little girl. If you take everything, we won't make it to the next settlement." Chief Bannon's expression didn't change. "Not my concern. This is the price for trespassing. Sevens." Everett Kane smiled grimly, pleased that his leader was finally taking proper action. He dismounted and began walking toward the wagon, clearly intending to begin the confiscation process immediately. That's when something extraordinary happened. Magnolia, who had been listening to the conversation with the solemn attention that children sometimes showed when they sensed adult worry, looked down at the bread in her small hands. She studied it for a long moment, then looked up at Chief Bannon's painted face. Her 8-year-old mind was processing what she had heard in her own simple way. These people were taking things because they needed them. Her parents had taught her about sharing, about helping people who didn't have enough. She didn't understand territorial disputes or sacred hunting grounds or the complex history of conflict between their peoples. All she understood was that these people seemed to need something, and she had something she could share. Standing up in the wagon with the fearless confidence that only children possessed, Magnolia held out her piece of bread toward Chief Bannon. Her voice was clear and sweet in the tense silence that had fallen over the canyon. "You can have my bread if you're hungry." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, stunning everyone within hearing into absolute silence. Everett Kane stopped mid-stride, his mouth falling open in disbelief. The other warriors exchanged confused glances, uncertain how to react to such an unprecedented gesture. Chief Bannon stared at the small offering in the child's outstretched hand, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. In 30 years of dealing with white settlers, no one had ever voluntarily offered him anything except bullets and curses. What this innocent child had just done would shatter every assumption he held about the people he had spent his life fighting. The piece of bread trembled slightly in Magnolia's small hand as she continued to hold it out toward the chief, her innocent eyes never wavering from his painted face. She had no way of knowing that her simple gesture had just stopped the heart of one of the most feared warriors in the territory. Chief Bannon felt something crack inside his chest. Not his ribs, but something deeper and more protected. The bread was barely a mouthful, stale and hard. Probably the last food this family possessed. Yet this child was offering it freely to someone she had every reason to fear. The memory that surfaced was sharp and painful. His own daughter, Little Sparrow, offering her last piece of dried meat to a wounded bird she had found. Even though the tribe was rationing food during a brutal winter, she had died that same winter, not from starvation, but from the white man's disease that swept through their camp. But this was different. This was the enemy's child showing the same pure generosity that had once lived in his daughter's heart. Everett Kane's voice cut through the chief's thoughts like a blade. "She mocks us," he said in their language, his tone sharp with anger. "The white child thinks to buy safe passage with crumbs. It's an insult." The other warriors murmured their agreement, their earlier confusion hardening into familiar resentment. They had seen too many tricks from settlers, false treaties, poisoned gifts, promises broken like twigs underfoot. To them, this was just another deception. Perhaps more clever because it used a child's apparent innocence. "Take their supplies and let them walk," Everett continued, his hand moving back to his weapon. "The desert will teach them the true cost of trespassing." Chief Bannon studied the young warrior's face and saw the hunger there. Not just for food, but for the satisfaction of justice served in the traditional way. Everett had lost his own brother in a settler raid 2 moons ago. The boy's anger was justified, his demands reasonable according to tribal law, but the child still stood there, arm outstretched, waiting patiently for an answer to her offer. Clyde and Clara exchanged terrified glances, understanding enough of the tension to know their daughter had somehow made the situation even more dangerous. Clara started to reach for Magnolia to pull her back and apologize for whatever offense she had caused. But Clyde caught her wrist. Something in the chief's expression had changed, Not softened exactly, but shifted into something more complex than simple hostility. Moving too quickly now might shatter whatever delicate moment was forming. Chief Bannon looked at the bread again, then at the child's face. She wasn't performing or calculating. She wasn't trying to manipulate or negotiate. She was simply doing what her heart told her was right, sharing what little she had with someone who seemed to need it. The silence stretched taut as boasting until finally, with movements slow and deliberate, Chief Bannon dismounted from his horse. Paris, the other warriors tensed, unsure what their leader intended. Everett Kane's eyes narrowed with suspicion and growing alarm. Step by careful step, the chief approached the wagon. Magnolia never flinched, never pulled her hand back, never showed anything but patient kindness in her young face. When he was close enough to touch the offered bread, Chief Bannon stopped. His weathered hand reached out, then hesitated inches from the child's fingers. What he did next would either bridge a gap that had seemed impossible to cross or trigger a violence that would haunt this canyon forever. Chief Bannon's fingers closed gently around the small piece of bread, careful not to touch the child's hand, but accepting her gift with the solemnity it deserved. The moment his weathered palm held the offering, something fundamental shifted in the canyon's atmosphere. Everett Kane's face contorted with disbelief and rage. "What are you doing?" he demanded in their native tongue, his voice rising to nearly a shout. "Have you forgotten what these people have taken from us? Have you forgotten Little Sparrow?" The mention of his daughter's name hit Chief Bannon like a physical blow. But instead of anger, it brought clarity. Little Sparrow would have done exactly what this white child had just done. She would have shared her last morsel with anyone who seemed hungry, regardless of their race or the wars being fought by adults. The chief brought the bread to his mouth and took a small bite. It was dry and nearly flavorless, but he chewed it slowly and deliberately, his eyes never leaving Magnolia's face. She smiled at him with pure joy, delighted that her gift had been accepted. That smile was the final crack in the walls Chief Bannon had built around his heart. But his acceptance of the bread had consequences he hadn't fully considered. Everett Kane snatched his tomahawk from his belt, his young face twisted with what he saw as his leader's betrayal of everything they stood for. "You shame us all," Everett snarled, pointing the weapon at the wagon. "These people are the enemy. Their kind killed my brother, drove our buffalo away, poisoned our rivers, and you take gifts from their spawn." Several of the other warriors shifted uneasily on their horses, torn between loyalty to their chief and agreement with Everett's passionate words. The young warriors' anger was infectious, reminding them all of their losses, their hunger, their justified rage against the settlers who had taken so much. But there were others among them who had been watching the child as closely as their chief had. They had seen the genuine sweetness in her gesture, the complete absence of fear or calculation. Some were fathers themselves, and they recognized something pure when they saw it. The tribal circle was fracturing, and everyone present could feel it happening. Chief Bannon finished chewing the bread and swallowed slowly. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of generations, but also a weariness that seemed to come from his very bones. "Sevens. The child shows honor," he said in English, ensuring the settlers could understand. "More honor than many warriors I have known." Everett Kane's tomahawk trembled in his grip. "You betray our people for a piece of stale bread and a child's trick." "No trick," Chief Bannon replied, switching back to their language. "I know tricks. I know lies. This was neither." The chief turned to face his warriors fully, and when he spoke again, his words carried the weight of a pronouncement that would change everything. Sometimes the spirits speak through the most unexpected voices. Sometimes wisdom comes from those too young to know they should hate. Clara held her breath, sensing that something momentous was happening, but afraid to hope. Clyde's hand found hers, squeezing tight as they watched their daughter unwittingly navigate the treacherous currents of a conflict that had been raging since before she was. Sevens. Born. But Everett Kane was not finished. The young warrior's rage had been building for months, fed by grief and hunger and the constant pressure of watching his people suffer, while settlers prospered on stolen land. What he did next would either vindicate Chief Bannon's moment of mercy or ensure that this canyon became the site of a tragedy that would echo through both people's histories forever. Everett Kane raised his tomahawk above his head, his face contorted with fury and grief. "If you will not uphold our laws, then I will," he declared, his voice cracking with emotion. "These settlers will pay the price that justice demands." The young warrior stepped toward the wagon, his weapon gleaming in the harsh sunlight. But as he moved, something unexpected happened that stopped him cold. Other warriors began to dismount from their horses, not to join Everett's assault, but to position themselves between him and the wagon. 3 older warriors, men who had fought beside Chief Bannon for decades, formed a protective line. Their faces were grim but resolute. "Stand aside, Everett demanded, his tomahawk still raised. "You forget who we are, what we fight for." But the eldest of the warriors, a man named Thunder Walker, whose own son had died in a settler raid, shook his head slowly. "I forget nothing, young one. But I see what you cannot." Thunder's weathered face turned toward Magnolia, who was still standing in the wagon, watching the confrontation with wide eyes, but showing no fear. That child gave freely what she could have kept. She showed honor when she could have shown hatred. If we cannot recognize such spirit, then we are no better than the worst of their kind. Everett Kane's tomahawk wavered as confusion mixed with his rage. These were men he respected, warriors whose courage he had never questioned. Yet they were protecting the very people they should be punishing. "She is the enemy's child," Everett insisted. But his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "She is a child," Chief Bannon said quietly, his voice carrying across the tense silence. "Nothing more, nothing less. And children sometimes see truths that warriors blind themselves to." The chief looked around at his divided band, seeing the uncertainty in their faces. Some still burned with Everett's righteous anger, remembering their losses and their people's suffering. Others had been moved by the simple purity of Magnolia's gesture, recognizing something sacred in her innocent generosity. This was the moment that would define not just this encounter, but the future relationship between their peoples. Chief Bannon understood that whatever decision he made here would echo through generations. Clyde watched the internal struggle among the warriors with growing hope, warring against terror in his chest. He could see that something had changed, that his daughter's simple act had somehow shifted the balance of power in ways he couldn't fully understand. But he also saw Everett Kane's desperation, the way grief and anger had twisted the young warrior's judgment. Men in such pain were capable of terrible things, regardless of what their leaders decided. Clara pulled Magnolia close, finally giving in to her maternal instincts to shield her child from the violence that still threatened to explode around them. But Magnolia resisted, looking over her mother's shoulder at the painted faces that surrounded them. In her 8-year-old mind, she was still trying to understand why giving someone her bread had made people so angry. She had been taught that sharing was good, that helping hungry people was the right thing to do. The complicated adult world of territorial disputes and racial hatred was beyond her comprehension. What she did understand was that some of these people still looked upset, and maybe they needed more help than just a piece of bread. What the little girl said next would either heal the fractures that were tearing the warrior band apart or trigger the violence that everyone was desperately trying to avoid. Magnolia looked around at all the tense faces and spoke with the simple honesty that only children possessed. "Are you all hungry? Because we don't have much food left. But Mama always says sharing makes everyone feel better." The words cut through the heated tension like a blade through silk. Even Everett Kane found his raised tomahawk slowly lowering as the child's innocent question registered in his mind. Here was an 8-year-old girl surrounded by armed warriors who had been debating whether to kill her family. And her only concern was whether everyone had enough to eat. She wasn't pleading for her life or offering bribes. She was simply extending the same generosity that had started this entire transformation. Thunderwalker felt his throat tighten with an emotion he hadn't experienced in years. His own granddaughter was about Magnolia's age, living with the tribe and learning the traditional ways. But would she show such courage and compassion when faced with strangers who had every reason to be her enemies? The question haunted him because he wasn't certain she would. Chief Bannon saw the change rippling through his warriors' faces. The anger was still there, the justified resentment and grief that had fueled years of conflict. But something else was growing alongside it. A recognition that hatred had its limits, and that sometimes wisdom came from the most unexpected sources. Everett Kane's tomahawk finally fell to his side, though his grip remained tight on the handle. "This changes nothing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "One child's words cannot erase what has been done to our people." "Sevens." "No," Chief Bannon agreed, stepping closer to the young warrior. "Nothing can erase our losses. Nothing can bring back the dead or restore what was taken. But perhaps we can choose what we become because of those losses." The chief's eyes moved from Everett to the other warriors, then to the settler family, watching with desperate hope. "This child shows us something we had forgotten in our anger. She shows us that not all of their kind carry hatred in their hearts. Some carry only the desire to share what little they have." Clara felt tears beginning to flow down her cheeks as she realized what was happening. Her daughter's simple act of kindness was somehow bridging a gap that had seemed impossible to cross. But she also understood that the situation remained precarious, balanced on a knife's edge between mercy and violence. Clyde cleared his throat carefully, knowing that the wrong words could still shatter this fragile moment. "My daughter doesn't understand the troubles between our peoples," he said quietly. "She only knows what we taught her to share with those in need. Sevens, and to treat all people with kindness." Chief Bannon nodded slowly. "Perhaps that is wisdom we have all forgotten." But even as hope began to bloom in the canyon, a new sound reached their ears. The distant thunder of approaching hoof-beats. Another group of riders was heading their way. And from the speed of their approach, they weren't coming in peace. The delicate balance that Magnolia's innocence had created was about to be tested by forces that might prove stronger than a little girl's generous heart. The approaching riders crested the canyon ridge with weapons drawn, a group of armed settlers who had been tracking the Winslow family's trail. Their leader was a hard-faced man named Dutch Corian, known throughout the territory for his hatred of the native tribes and his quick trigger finger. Well, Dutch called out as he surveyed the scene below. "Looks like we got ourselves a proper standoff here." Chief Bannon immediately recognized the danger. These weren't desperate refugees like the Winslow family. These were men who came looking for trouble. The kind who would turn this canyon into a battleground without hesitation. Dutch's eyes fixed on the warriors surrounding the wagon, and his smile turned predatory. "You folks having some difficulty with the locals? Don't worry. We'll sort this out quick enough." The settler raised his rifle, aiming directly at Chief Bannon's chest. "Time for you red devils to learn some respect." But before Dutch could fire, something extraordinary happened. Chief Bannon stepped protectively in front of the Winslow wagon, placing himself between the aggressive settlers and the family he had been threatening just moments before. His warriors immediately flanked him, their own weapons ready. "These people are under our protection," Chief Bannon declared, his voice carrying absolute authority. Dutch's face twisted with confusion and rage. "Have you lost your mind, Clyde? You're siding with savages over your own kind?" Clyde Winslow found his voice strengthened by the chief's unexpected protection. "These men have shown more honor in the last hour than you've shown in your entire life." Dutch Everett Kane, who had been struggling with conflicted emotions, suddenly saw the situation with crystal clarity. These new settlers represented everything ugly about the people who had invaded their land. The greed, the hatred, the willingness to kill without cause. They were nothing like the child who had offered her bread with such pure generosity. The young warrior moved to stand beside his chief, his tomahawk ready. The child showed us who they could be, he said quietly. These others show us who we refuse to become. Thunder Alker and the other warriors formed a protective circle around the Winslow wagon. Their message unmistakable. Dutch and his men found themselves facing a united force of tribal warriors who were clearly prepared to fight to protect the very settlers they had expected to find under attack. The confrontation lasted only minutes. Faced with superior numbers and warriors who knew every inch of the terrain, Dutch's group retreated with angry curses and threats that echoed emptily off the canyon walls. When the dust settled, Chief Bannon turned back to the Winslow family. Magnolia was still standing in the wagon, watching everything with wide eyes, but showing no fear. Her simple trust had created something that seemed impossible just an hour before. "You may pass safely," Chief Bannon told Clyde, his voice formal, but warm. "And when you reach your destination, tell them what happened here. Tell them that a little girl's kindness taught warriors to remember their honor." Clara wiped tears from her eyes as she hugged Magnolia close. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate but heartfelt. As the Winslow wagon rolled away toward safety, Chief Bannon looked down at the small piece of bread he still held in his weathered hand. Such a tiny thing to have changed so much. Everett Kane approached his chief, his earlier anger replaced by something like wonder. "How did you know?" he asked. Chief Bannon smiled, the first genuine smile he had worn in months. Sometimes the spirits speak through children because they have not yet learned to stop listening. The warriors watched until the wagon disappeared around a bend in the canyon, carrying with it a family that would forever remember the day when a little girl's generosity bridged the gap between two worlds that had forgotten how to see each other's humanity. In that quiet canyon, a new understanding had been born, one that would grow and spread like ripples from a stone dropped into still water, changing both peoples forever. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and unexpected friendships emerge in the wild frontier. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.